The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the oldest, largest, and most mysterious monuments ever constructed on Earth. The Sphinx is a repository full of esoteric knowledge. It is far older than the current academic paradigm claims, and its true origin remains unexplained. A substantial portion of academia believes the sculpture was carved probably in the reign of the king Khafre during the period of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. However, some scholars claim it was created during the reign of Djedefre, Khafre's brother. Thus, it is important to point out that on this most fundamental question, the academic scholars do not have a full consensus. Neither is there full consensus on its purpose. Egyptologist Miroslav Werner sums it up rather succinctly. Although it has often been measured, described, investigated using the most up-to-date scientific technical means, and discussed at special scientific conferences, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who built it? When? And why? At the end of the day, academia possesses only theories and good guesses in its attempt to answer the riddles of the Great Sphinx. Technically speaking, the Great Sphinx is not a traditional sphinx. Although heavily influenced by Egyptian and later Mesopotamian mythology, the classical Greek depiction of the Sphinx consists of the body of a lion, the head of a woman, and the wings of a bird. Giza's male-identifying landmark is technically an androsphinx. The lack of wings further muddles its accepted taxonomy. The sculpture was buried for most of its life in the sand. It was King Thutmose who placed a stela between the front paws of the figure. On it, Thutmose describes an event while he was still a prince when he had gone hunting and fell asleep in the shade of the Sphinx. During a dream, the Sphinx spoke to Thutmose and told him to clear away the sand. The Sphinx told him that if he did this, he would be rewarded with the kingship of Egypt. Thutmose carried out this request, and the Sphinx held up his end of the bargain. The 3 millennia that followed again buried the monument. In the more modern era, when Napoleon arrived in Egypt in 1798, the Sphinx was buried once more with sand up to its neck. It is widely accepted that the nose had been missing for at least 400 years at that point. Between 1816 and 1817, the Genoese merchant Caviglia tried to clear away the sand, but he only managed to dig a trench down the chest of the statue and along the length of the forepaws. In 1858, Auguste Mariette, the founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, managed to clear the sand down to the rock floor of the ditch around the Sphinx, discovering in the process several sections of the protective walls around the ditch, as well as odd masonry boxes along the body of the monument which might have served as small shrines. However, he apparently still did not clear all the sand. In 1885, Gaston Maspero, then director of the Antiquities Service, once again tried to clear the Sphinx, but after exposing the earlier work of Caviglia and Mariette, he also was forced to abandon the project due to logistical problems. Between 1925 and 1936, French engineer Émile Barrès excavated the Sphinx on behalf of the Antiquities Service, and apparently for the first time since antiquity, the great beast once again became exposed to the elements. The constant barrage of sand undoubtedly played its part in transforming the sculpture to its contemporary color. In its most pristine existence, the Sphinx may have been completely covered in vivid paint. Remnants of red can be found on the statue's face, while hints of blue and yellow remain on the body. During the restoration in the 1920s, the Great Sphinx suffered the loss of part of its iconic headdress, as well as severe damage to the head and neck. Consequently, the Egyptian government employed a team of engineers to patch up the statue in 1931, but these restorations began wreaking havoc on the soft limestone, and in 1988, a 700-pound piece of the shoulder fell in front of a German reporter. Fortunately, the sculpture is now under a much more thorough and professional restoration. But do not count on the beard coming back. Today, remnants of the Great Sphinx beard, which was eventually shaved off the statue's chin via erosion, live in the British Museum and in the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities, established in Cairo in 1858. However, French archaeologist Vasil Dobrev asserts that the beard was not an original component of the statue, but a later amendment. He backs up his hypothesis with the argument that removal of the beard, if attached from the get-go, would have resulted in damage to the statue's chin that isn't readily apparent. The British Museum supports Dobrev's assessment, proposing that the beard was added to the Sphinx at some point during or soon after Thutmose IV's restoration project. As we just explained, even within academic circles, the scholars cannot agree upon the age of the Sphinx. A more compelling case for the earlier construction of the monument lies in the fact that, while archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions and evidence pertaining to the construction of the Giza pyramids during the 4th dynasty, there is no reference to the Sphinx regarding the housing of workers, their diet, or their compensation. Another argument against the Sphinx being built by Khafre is that the face is not his. Geologist Robert Schoch has put forth that not only was the face not Khafre's, but also the Sphinx itself was much older than Khafre's reign. Schoch hired forensic specialist Frank Domingo, with over 20 years of experience in the New York Police Department sketching suspects and creating facial reconstructions, to examine the Sphinx and Khafre's statue and determine if they bore the same face. Domingo's conclusion, after an exhaustive study of both works, was that they represented two different people. Schoch further claims that the present face is not that of a man, but a woman. Schoch contends that the Sphinx is centuries older than mainstream Egyptology claims it is. He has noted that the erosion marks on the Sphinx suggest extensive rainfall over a very prolonged period. This kind of weather pattern was not evident at the time of the 4th dynasty of Egypt, and so the statue is obviously older than that period. In answer to the challenge from mainstream Egyptology to show evidence of a culture predating the traditionally accepted time of Egyptian civilization, one which could have created a monument such as the Sphinx, Schoch points to the ancient site of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, which dates back 10,000 years and is attributed to no known civilization. Sculpture found at Göbekli Tepe is as sophisticated as that of the Sphinx, and sometimes more so. Evidence suggesting a construction period for the Sphinx, greatly predating the 4th dynasty, may be indicated by the astronomical significance of its shape, being that of a lion. Roughly every 2,000 years, and because of the precession of the equinoxes, the sun on the spring equinox rises against the stellar background of a different constellation. For the past 2,000 years, that constellation has been Pisces, the fish, symbol of the Christian age. Prior to the age of Pisces, it was the age of Aries the ram, and before that, it was the age of Taurus the bull. It is interesting to note that during the 1st and 2nd millennia BC, approximately the age of Aries, ram-oriented iconography was common in dynastic Egypt, while during the age of Taurus, the bull cult arose in Minoan Crete. Perhaps the builders of the Sphinx likewise used astrological symbolism in designing their monumental sculpture. Geological findings indicate that the Sphinx may have been sculpted sometime before 10,000 BC, and this period coincides with the age of Leo the Lion, which lasted from 10,970 to 8,810 BC. Further support for this vast age of the Sphinx comes from a surprising sky-ground correlation proven by sophisticated computer programs such as Sky Globe 3.6. These computer programs can generate precise pictures of any portion of the night sky as seen from different places on Earth at any time in the distant past or future. Graham Hancock explains in Heaven's Mirror that computer simulations show that in 10,500 BC, the constellation of Leo housed the sun on the spring equinox. For example, an hour before dawn in that epoch, Leo would have reclined due east along the horizon in the place where the sun would soon rise. This means that the lion-bodied Sphinx, with its due east orientation, would have gazed directly on that morning at the one constellation in the sky that might reasonably be regarded as its own celestial counterpart. In reality, Hancock is simply restating a theory presented about a century earlier. In 1911's The New Avatar and the Destiny of the Soul, the author quotes astrologer John Kilduff. This Sphinx apparently represents the constellations Leo and Virgo. It has a lion's body and a woman's head and breast. When the Sphinx was built, it seems the spring equinox occupied a point between these two constellations, and as the spring, or Easter, festivals of the ancients were held on or about March 21st of our calendar, this Sphinx was the representation of Leo and Virgo, the point in which the sun crossed the equator. Writers Robert and Olivia Temple claim that not only is the face of the Sphinx not Khafre's, it is not even the original face of the statue. The head of the Sphinx is notably out of proportion to the rest of the body. It is significantly smaller. The Temples argue that this is because the Sphinx was not carved in the 4th dynasty under Khafre but centuries earlier and was not originally a lion but the jackal god Anubis. According to this theory, the great statue was Anubis, who traditionally guarded over a necropolis, and such a statue would certainly fit the location the Sphinx occupies at Giza. In the 4th century, the Temples claim, the statue was recarved to depict a lion with a king's head because the lion was a popular figure at the time. The kind of anthropomorphism the Sphinx represents was clearly established by the 4th dynasty. But it is unclear how far back in Egyptian civilization it was observed or how it developed. Geologist Colin Reeder argues that the ancient Egyptians were masters in stonework and could not possibly have miscalculated in carving the Sphinx, nor would they have shrunk the head out of proportion with the body for the sake of stability. There are plenty of other monuments, he notes, in perfect proportion which have stood the test of time. Reeder argues, in a manner similar to the Temples, that the Sphinx initially possessed a different head, asserting that it was that of a lioness rather than Anubis. He bolsters his argument by referencing a Sphinx statue located in the Cairo Museum, which he believes to have originally depicted a lioness that underwent alterations, resulting in the removal of its ears and a resculpting of its face. Reeder's primary contention, like that of others, is that there is no satisfactory explanation for the weathering of the Sphinx or the proportion of the head than that it predates the 4th dynasty and was once a different monument. Edgar Cayce, also known as the Sleeping Prophet, had the ability to put himself into a deep trance. He stated in some of his trances that Egypt was the repository for records of the alleged civilization of Atlantis, about 10,500 BC. This repository was an underground library called the Hall of Records that contained the wisdom of Atlantis. Cayce claims that the Sphinx points in the direction of the Hall of Records. His reading states, "There is a chamber or passage from the right forepaw of the Sphinx to this entrance of the Hall of Records, or chamber." In the 1980s and 1990s, the Edgar Cayce Foundation conducted research in Egypt around the Sphinx to verify Cayce's reading. Although researchers from all over the world have begun to look for this chamber with very sophisticated instruments, they have not found the Hall of Records. the most prolific ancient astronaut researcher during the modern era, has also offered an explanation for the Sphinx. Zechariah Sitchin writes that the Great Sphinx was designed and precisely located in terms of exact latitude and longitude by the Anunnaki. On page 181 of The Wars of Gods and Men, he shows a diagram of a layout involving the general area of Giza, Sinai, Israel, and Lebanon. If you look at this layout, you will notice a dotted line drawn from Giza to where Sitchin thinks the Anunnaki had spaceport facilities in the Sinai. From 10,500 to 7,000 years ago, the Anunnaki rebuilt Mesopotamia. Ningishzida, known as Thoth to the Egyptians, built 2 pyramids in Giza. The first, smaller pyramid Ningishzida built was a scale model of the Great One. The larger pyramid, the Great Pyramid, was to be the southwestern marker of a line extending from Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, running through the landing platform at Baalbek in Lebanon, and ending at this Great Pyramid on the Nile. Enki, Ningishzida's father, solicited Enlil, Enki's brother, to authorize a monument to Ningishzida for designing the pyramids. Let us beside the twin peaks a monument create the age of the lion to announce, the image of Ningishzida, the peak's designer, let its face be, let it precisely toward the place of celestial chariots gaze. The actual spaceport was to be run by Enlil's son, Utu. The spaceport was on the 30th parallel, the line of division between the realms of lineage Enlil north of the parallel and the realms of lineage Enki south of the 30th. Marduk, Ningishzida's brother, who'd been disinherited as future king of Nibiru for marrying an earthling, protested the glory given his younger brother and the authority given Utu. Marduk subsequently was defeated in battle by Ninurta and banished to the northern hemisphere. In 3850 BC, King Anu visited Earth and pardoned Marduk. Then, in 3100 BC, Marduk returned to Egypt and ousted Ningishzida. When Marduk, after a long absence to the land of the Two Narrows, returned, Ningishzida as its master he there found. With the aid of offspring of the Anunnaki who earthlings espouse did Ningishzida the land oversee, that Marduk had once planned and instructed by Ningishzida was overturned. For the next 350 years, Marduk, now called Ra, and Ningishzida clashed over Egypt. Finally, Enki, their father, ordered Ningishzida to leave Egypt to Marduk. The Sphinx witnessed the departure of Thoth with his followers to be among the first Americans. To erase Ningishzida's memory, Marduk on the stone lion his image with that of his son Asar replaced. Marduk taught his puppet rulers, the pharaohs, that the Sphinx would guide them when they died, to an afterlife, when their Ka, or spirit, joined the gods in their heavenly ascents. Marduk rewrote Egyptian history. In it he demoted Ningishzida in his version of history to the divine measurer, and replaced Ningishzida's image on the stone lion. The lack of consensus among academics, coupled with compelling astronomical and archaeological findings from those outside of the White Towers, leads the archive to conclude that the Great Sphinx is much older than Egyptologists want to admit. And admit is the operative term. First, it is important to point out that all Egyptologists are not necessarily archaeologists or even academics for that matter. To be an Egyptologist primarily means that your research and theories are arbitrarily restricted to a certain predetermined timeline of dynastic Egypt. Second, Egyptologists are also not too keen on admitting that a much more advanced civilization occupied the area before their direct ancestors. As we move into the outer fringes of archaeology, we can see there is a small fraction of scholars that are openly questioning the age. Rebel researchers are blazing a trail of new thought regarding the true antiquity of the Sphinx without the constraints of a potentially erroneous outline. Schock's retort to Egyptologists about an advanced civilization predating the timeline is one of extreme intrigue and perplexity. While a few academic scholars and amateur archaeologists such as Hancock posit the existence of a lost civilization predating this period, none of them is really asking the next logical question: where did they come from? Enter Zecharia Sitchin. He has provided an explanation to that very question. However, in very much the same way establishment academics shun and resist the so-called fringe theories of their own colleagues, the mainstream goes so far as to ridicule the ancient astronaut hypothesis. And this no doubt explains why the fringe scholars veer away from such a connection. Simply because a viable hypothesis that utilizes astronomical, archaeological, and scientific evidence does not comport with the established timelines of modern academia, such hypothesis is deemed unworthy of consideration in their view. Fortunately, it is not 1950 anymore, and academia no longer controls the narrative. And the truth is this: after centuries of research and excavation, the academic scholars for the most part have no consensus on who built the Sphinx, when the Sphinx was built, and why the Sphinx was built. In absence of factually proven answers to these questions, it would seem rather ignorant to shut the door categorically on other potential explanations.